is Tiki Technical Tuesday, and today we are going to attempt the very first casting of the Lil Ammy giant ammonite baby mug. If you haven't watched the last episode of Tiki Technical Tuesday, now is a good time to do it because we take this little sketch that I drew years ago and turned it into a very complicated clay sculpture that involved multiple parts that slid together and turned out to be a baby version of the giant ammonites in the film Mysterious Island, a little homage to Ray Harryhausen and some of the fantastical prehistoric creatures that I love that live under the water. Okay, honest admission time, I did not record any of the mold making for this mug because I covered that pretty in-depth back on episode 47. Go back and check it out if you want to learn how molds are made. It's a complicated process, it's a stressful process, and quite frankly, this thing was so complicated I didn't want to add the extra panic and stress of trying to tape it while doing it. So that takes us to here. Behold the master silicone molds for the casting molds for the Lil Ammy mug. And yes, there's a lot of them. This thing's complicated. I spent a long time trying to figure out how to make the parting lines on these and where I'm going to break up the molds, and this is what I ended up with. A 4-piece mold for the shell section and then a 5-piece mold for the critter part. The critter part had a lot of little bendy, wiggly bits, and it took me a long time to figure out how to break it into different parts for molding. And as always with molding, you want to make as few parts as possible because you don't want to have to clean up all of the seam lines after casting. The fewer the seam lines, the faster the casting process goes. So anyways, all in all, we ended up with 9 pieces total to cast both parts. Okay, so last Thursday, I started pouring molds. I poured this one on Thursday, I poured this one on Friday. So this one, I do believe, is dry enough to pour. We're gonna give it a shot. And I think this one is also, no, it's still cool to the touch. I'm gonna wait. So today, we're just gonna try pouring number 1. Why am I so nervous? I'm so glad you asked. Supply chain issue number 1 was plywood. I typically make my mold boxes out of this Baltic birch plywood. It's a super high grade plywood. It has got 9 beautiful, even layers of wood all sandwiched together with alternating grain, and they're all even in thickness. And it makes for a super, super sturdy piece of plywood. Now, I reuse these mold boxes whenever I can, if the new molds will fit into these older boxes. When I can't, I have to make a new box, so I had to buy some more plywood. Unfortunately, they didn't have this in stock anymore. The only stuff I could get was a pre-finished plywood. It already had a shiny coat of urethane on it. I thought, hey, maybe that's a good thing. But it was only 6 layers with 2 really thin veneers on each side, and there are these tons of just horrible voids in them and overlaps. Anyways, the Craig jig couldn't really get a good bite in it. It didn't really make good pocket holes, and it's just not as stable. It was a little more prone to flexing. Did it work? Yes. I thought maybe this would save me some time having it pre-finished, but it didn't really. I don't like the urethane finish that's on there. It was really chipping when I cut it, and it really kind of gripped the silicone when I would try to slide the silicone in and out of the molds. At any rate, I'll never use this again. They are going to get the good stuff back in stock soon, so the next mold set that I do, I'm definitely going to wait till I can get this good stuff. Yeah. So, supply chain issue number 2 was... I always like to use USG pottery plaster number 1. It is the industry standard, and that is what all of these dead bastard mugs were poured out of. It casts beautifully. I know how to use it. I've used it for years. Everybody uses it. I should also note that these are going to be destroyed this week. That's why they're stacked up over here. So everybody uses it. It's great stuff. But you can't get it anymore. I guess that there's some sort of big building boom going on, and USG's putting all their plaster into making drywall and not into making plaster for us ceramics people. So I had to use this. This is Industrial Plaster by Georgia Pacific. It's like called K something. I don't know. I'll put it up here in the graphics. And it's a giant question mark. I have no idea if it'll work. I mean, according to the internet, it's just fine. It's a little less expensive, and people say it works great, but I don't know. I don't know how it will cast. I don't know how it will mix and pour. I don't know how long it'll last. It's all these questions that, to be honest, have been kind of keeping me awake at night. Okay, folks, it's time for us to finally pour some slip into these molds. Now, before we get started, there's one tiny little thing that I want to do, and that is to make some air channels here so I don't catch an air bubble at the tip of the tentacles while the slip rises inside of this mold. I'm going to use a little stainless steel tool and scribe a tiny little channel, just enough to let the air out, but it's not going to be like, a spigot for slip to fill and clog. And then once that's done, I just blow out the plaster dust and we close the mold back up, and we get it onto the table for the magic of slip pouring. Okay, that went pretty well. I realized as soon as I started pouring the slip that I forgot to cut. I was also going to cut a little air channel in this mold because I think it needed one at the top of the shell. Maybe just the two mold halves fitting together, just that seam will allow enough air to escape without trapping a bubble. We'll find out when we open this in a little while. Everybody please cross your fingers. I'm going for 55 minutes on my dwell time, and it's a total guess because of this new plaster. 55 minutes is how long I was dwelling the Dead Bastard mugs that we just finished casting, and they turned out great. So I know with this slip and that old plaster and kind of this weather, I liked that timing. Now, it's a lot warmer and drier than it has been, and also this plaster is a huge unknown. It might be super absorbent and suck all the water out right away, or it might not be absorbent at all and I have to double or triple the times. I don't know. So that is why we're doing this one test today. And that is why I have been crossing my fingers constantly for the last 10 minutes since I started the pour. Okay, we've got about a minute left and it hasn't gone down very well. Now, I know I have a pretty big well at the top of this mold to kind of hold the extra slip so that it has like a reservoir to draw on as the slip level drops. But this one really hasn't dropped. This one's dropped a little more. I mean, it's a larger piece. I have to remember in my head that the critter part of the ammonite is very small, so it's not going to draw a lot of slip, whereas the shell is a bigger piece and the level has in fact dropped quite a bit. So I think we're just going to run with this 55-minute timing for now. I'm not saying it's going to work, but the experiment looks like it's going okay. So we will be flipping this in exactly 44 seconds. I give it a little swirl just in case the slip has gelled at all inside of the mold. I mean, it doesn't look like it's gelled, but I like to just wake it up before draining it. So we're gonna let the mold sit here for a good half hour to drip out all the extra slip back into the slip reservoir that it lives in the slip table before we set them on the table for further drying. Alrighty, well, the other unknown that we have to deal with is how long do we let these dry before opening them? It's always a question, and since this is a new plaster, I really don't know. I mean, I usually give these a couple of hours at least before opening them. Since this plaster is new, maybe it needs more time. Maybe it needs less time. I don't know. I'm going to go have breakfast right now. I'm going to let these sit for a few hours. It's currently 7:30. I won't open these until 9:30 or 10, just to be on the safe side. So let's all continue to do that thing we've been doing. and I'll see you at 10:30. Okay, it's been 2 hours, and I think we're going to try to open them up. For opening molds, I always like to use my mold opening pliers. I'll put a link to these in the description of the video, and a rubber kidney. It is great for doing exactly this, and that is trimming out the top pour sprue. I don't like to have I don't like all the excess clay building up around the pour sprue. I think it makes it hard to get the model out of the mold, so I like to get all of this extra clay out of the way before we actually get to the nitty-gritty of opening this thing up. Success! So happy about this. I keep it under plastic while we move on to the next part. Okay, that went really well. Super happy with the shell. The thickness looks good. Everything looks good so far. So I'm going to clean up the shell mold to get it ready for casting tomorrow morning. And then I got to open up the critter half. And now that's the part that I'm a little worried about. It's a complicated mold. I am fairly sure that it has no undercuts, but I'm not positive, and I don't know the best order of opening, so we're gonna figure it out while we're going along. Here we go. Success! Unbelievably happy with the way the first casting turned out. Yeah, feels good. Now we've got to stick them together. Whoa. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'm going to put the little ammonite casting under plastic to keep it from drying out because we have to do a few things before we stick them together. Mainly, we've got to clean this mold to get it ready for casting tomorrow, and then we've got to seam these castings. That means that we're going to get rid of all of the lines that happen in the slip where these mold pieces come together. To do that, we're going to use a handful of tools on a clean work surface. I like to keep things clean and tidy. For seaming, I like to use an X-Acto knife. I use a rough sponge, a smooth sponge, and a little wire sculpting tool. I always start seaming by removing the casting sprue from the top of the mug. I use an X-Acto knife to cut away that extra unnecessary clay. Once I've got it cut away, I'll go in with my rough sponge and I kind of smooth out that cut edge that I just put on there. And then after the rough sponge, I'll go back with the smooth sponge to further smooth out any tool marks and get that important transition edge of the mug nice and smooth and pristine looking. I then tackle the seam lines themselves, either the lines that occur in the areas that the mold pieces join together. I'll peel them away with a sculpting tool like this, and then I go back and I actually kind of mash and smooth out that image. I want to recompress the clay with my fingertips to make sure that there's no visible seam lines, if at all possible. Okay, I've got the seam taken care of on the critter portion of the ammonite mug. Very happy with it. There's still stuff to learn, but it's looking great. We've now come to the critical stage of this whole operation where we've got to stick this to the shell. And it's going to involve using slip as glue, and it will also involve crossed fingers, like everything else this morning. But first, I just need to trip off the casting sprue from this. I wanted to save that for the last bit because I didn't want this edge to dry out. And we will stick this thing together. not very even. I'm gonna use a sponge.
So I'm going off and getting a big sponge to use as kind of sandpaper. It's a slightly damp sponge. I'm just going to rub the piece over it like this and to try to really level out and flatten that joining edge that's going to be matching up against the shell portion of the mug. Now here I grab the shell portion, and dry hands are critical. I've got water on my hands and I don't want to get fingerprints all over the pieces. Double checking my fit, because once these things get stuck together with slip, it's kind of no turning back. Now I've got the slip inside of this little dropper bottle here, and it has a little kind of hypodermic needle tip on it, which lets you run out a really fine bead of slip like this. I'm going to put a bead of slip around the edge of the critter, and then once I've got a good bead on there, I'm going to really nestle it into the shell. I want to kind of just squish these things together and really get that slip to just bond the two pieces together. And once they're fired, it will be one single piece of clay.
It's so awesome. So that is a very successful first day of casting. Could not be happier. It is a thrill to see something that was in clay forever, and then the clay gets destroyed because you make a plaster mold of it, and then you're only looking at a negative shape of it, and then to finally see it as a positive and as a hollow mug, it's super cool. Now, astute ceramic viewers will think to themselves, did I not just create a giant air bubble by putting this critter section onto this shell section? And I did. So that is why we are going to poke a tiny little puka in the bottom of it, just to make sure the thing does not explode in the kiln. If we don't do that, the air inside of the head chamber will expand as it heats up, and it will actually blow the head off of the shell.
So there you have it, folks. Lil Ammy mug, casting one, day one. I could not be happier. It's fantastic. So fantastic, in fact, that the next day we went back to the studio, pulled those two other molds that were now dry enough to use, and we cast 3 more, and then we did that again the next day and the next. More castings means more practice, and that let me refine my techniques for seaming, for handling, and for joining these together. I totally stopped using that little hypodermic squeezy bottle full of slip and opted for this, a Tupperware full of slip. It lets me dip the ammonite critter half in there, get a good coat of slip on it, and really get just a solid, good join on these 2 clay pieces. So day 2 is when the magic of slip casting really starts to show itself. We had 1 casting on day 1, and now day 2, we are going to have 4 castings. It's fantastic to watch this little army of clay critters multiply right before your eyes.
It's a little ammonite army. So happy with these. We are learning as we go. Day 1 came out pretty good. Day 2, much better. Getting better at sticking them together. We're getting better at handling them. We're just learning the ins and outs of this new bicycle that we're learning how to ride. It's such an awkward metaphor, but it's very true. It's very true. Each mug is so different. The way you hold it is different. There's just so many things to learn. Anyway, what's the story with these guys? These are going to be artist proofs. I'm going to use them to practice glazing. So at the end of the week, they're going to go into the kiln for a bisque firing, and then it is glaze test mania. I'm still casting molds. We're making the rest of the production molds. I'm going to do a total of 8 sets. So that'll be 16 molds total, which is about the maximum amount that we can handle in a day between the two of us, seaming and casting. So I think that's about the end of this episode of Tiki Technical Tuesday. A little bit of a short one, but I just couldn't wait to share these with you. Now, if you are enjoying this, please subscribe and like, of course. And better yet, if you like this channel, tell a friend. If you have a friend that might be interested in watching, send them a link. Anyway, thank you so much, and I will see you next episode.